speaks at a Baltimore City Council meeting last month over City Council President Nick Mosby's dollar home plan.
Sir, you cannot accuse me of that.
Mosby went on to apologize for inviting the group at the center of the chaos. Some council members saying it's not enough.
I think he needs a stronger apology to the public.
Tonight, in the aftermath of that tense meeting, our panel of experts shedding light on the controversial program at the center of it all. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Your Voice, Your Future City in Crisis Town Hall. I'm Mackenzie Frost. Tonight, our panel of experts putting City Council President Nick Mosby's Dollar Homes program under the microscope. The program is an attempt to deal with the longstanding problem in Baltimore, vacant homes. According to Open Baltimore, there are nearly 15,000 vacant homes across the city. Not all of those homes would qualify for the program, and not everyone agrees the Dollar Homes program is the right solution. Let's take a closer look at the back and forth. Council President Nick Mosby's Dollar Home program.
Good evening, everyone.
Back up for debate.
To prioritize Baltimore City residents.
Unlike a similar Dollar Home program from the 1970s, Mosby's plan targets longtime Baltimoreans who have been renting rather than owning their home. Plus, he's targeting areas in the city he says have been left out by redlining.
That the individuals that had to deal with those, that they have access and they have first seat in the line.
But the concerns from some other council members and departments, who will qualify and how to pay for it.
DHCD does not presently have the financial capacity to implement the program.
Mosby says the funding will come from the American Rescue Plan, but he doesn't have the authority to dole out that cash. Only Mayor Brandon Scott does. And the mayor's spokesperson issuing a statement saying Mosby's plan, quote, does not match the mayor's vision for meaningful policy. This legislation appears more harmful than helpful. To date, there hasn't been a price tag attached to Mosby's plan, but the grants will be capped at $50,000 for qualifying participants to renovate their homes. In March, Mosby's project failed to make it out of committee with a 7-7 deadlock vote. Fast forward to the end of April, he's bringing it back up, this time with support from a national housing group and Bruce Marks, who provided controversial testimony.
All those criticisms that you're saying, that's because the city and the mayor is bought and paid for by the real estate industry. Because that is absolutely bullshit for the stuff that you're saying.
That's an outrageous claim. That's an
Councilman Cohen, we've gone over that. I think I did a good job of controlling the chamber to go back and forth.
I feel on behalf of my colleague and my mayor that I'm going to need to express my concern about it.
Mr. President, I did that. Now, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do.
Ask it.
Mosby's attempting to target the city's vast vacant home problem, but prioritizing legacy Baltimoreans. Opponents argue the qualifications are narrow and the number of vacant properties being discussed is minor.
Out of the 15,000 vacant properties that we have, about 1,200 of them are city owned, and they're kind of scattered all over the place.
That's just 8% of the city's vacant properties. Councilwoman Odette Ramos says she agrees with the premise about addressing the vacant and affordable housing crisis, but she says the council president's plan isn't the way to do it.
She's concerned that if residents did get a construction loan for a vacant property, which would cost a lot of money, then at the end of the day, the value of the property is not the same as the value of the loan, and therefore the person is underwater.
The latest hearing ended without a vote. All right, let's meet our panelists tonight. Jeremy Aldridge is a local attorney, is a former Baltimore City prosecutor. Sean Kennedy, a visiting fellow at the Maryland Public Policy Institute. And finally, David Williams, the president of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Let's dive right into this topic. And I want to go down the line and ask each one of you, what's your take on this Dollar Homes program? It's not new to Baltimore. We've seen it happen in the past. But first, we'll start with you, David Williams. What do you think of this newest recall of this program introduced by the council president?
Well, this is fascinating, and let's start at the beginning here about whether everyone should own a home. And we saw the housing bubble in 2008, 2009, and when you put people in a home comes with a lot of fiscal responsibility for that person. So I think, you know, again, we're going to start at the beginning here, and maybe not everyone should own a home, and this is a great risk to taxpayers, which obviously we can get into later.
All right, Sean Kennedy, what do you think of this program and this policy introduced by the council president?
Well, I think it's shooting in the right direction, but with the wrong bullets. In this case, we're firing a lot of money at a problem, which is home ownership and vacant housing in Baltimore, without necessarily thinking through what the solution looks like. And I actually am going to disagree with David and say it's pretty evident that homeownership is a positive and would be a huge boon to Baltimore if more people could afford, obviously, and maintain and sustain their homeownership. It roots people in the community. It creates taxpayers. It creates a stakeholders society. Those are all things Baltimore desperately needs. But doing it in this way may not be the best solution, but giving people the opportunity to purchase and own and maintain homes here in the city, that's a great thing. What Council President Mosby has proposed may not be the right solution, and we'll obviously get into that in more detail.
All right, let's put a pin in that conversation and come back to it. But first, Jeremy, your thoughts on it?
I think this is a Band-Aid on a shotgun wound. The bottom line is, it's not just my time as a former prosecutor. I was a hearing officer at the Environmental Control Board, where I had thousands of city homeowners come before me that inherited homes, that bought homes for very low amounts of money. And the problems that they ran into, whether it was inability to procure homeowners insurance, whether it was having to deal with housing citations as a result of their inability to procure funds, maybe moving funds in other directions towards other family needs, and inability to invest in their rental properties or even their own homes that they purchased. We have to make sure that the consumers, meaning the actual people purchasing these homes, are set up for success and not failure. And I think this program heads in the opposite direction.
All right, David, let's go back to you because you said, I want to get your thoughts on if this isn't the right idea, what do you think is the best way to address some of the problems, especially when it comes to the vacants that we're seeing in the city?
Well, one way to address that is, well, first of all, we have to look at what's happened in other cities. And other cities, they've had very low participation rates in this program. And I think that's the biggest red flag right now is that this hasn't worked. And we're talking about a massive amount of taxpayer dollars to do this. And what are the metrics for success? Is it just giving out $50,000 to someone to fix up their home? And is there going to be any follow-up to see if they actually did this? And, if you look at the cost of rehabilitating a property, it's a lot more than $50,000. So you're really going to put people at a fiscal disadvantage when you do this. And so I think that, look at other ways, maybe, lowering property taxes and, making it easier to buy a home rather than just giving out cash.
Well, and that's something, too, we should talk about because during the debates about all of this, we know that the city's housing department hasn't necessarily been on board with this specific proposal. During the debates that we heard, we saw the heated debate during the city council meeting talking about it. The housing department warned of they don't necessarily have the staff members to handle the level of applications coming in to handle it. And then also we don't exactly know the specific price tag of this program. The council president hasn't put a specific price tag on it. He's talking about using American Rescue Plan dollars, but that's really not up to him to decide, or the city council in general. That comes from the mayor. So where does the money come from, David?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And we've heard some estimates that he wanted to use a third of the rescue money. So we're talking $150 to $200 million, which is an extraordinary price tag for a program that there's no guarantee of success. And that means that takes away from other priorities in the city. So, again, $200 million out of $641 million is a lot. And, the city really needs to be, more conscious when it comes to spending money.
Sean, you said this program necessarily wasn't the right idea. What do you think is the best approach?
Well, the best approach is to encourage people to be responsible homeowners. And one of the ways to do that is to put them in a path of success, like Jeremy mentioned, is to look at what the tax situation is here. We actually have, in addition to the 15,000 vacants, there are over 11,500 residential-only properties on the tax sale list and about $3 billion worth of real property in the city's hands already. Of those 11,500 properties that are residential and are on the tax sale list, i.e. the city of Baltimore is going to sell them to the highest bidder, they owe a total of they owe a total of $300 million. But in fact, this is striking. Half of them owe less than $1,000, less than $1,000 in tax liens. These people, if they knew how much they owed and they were given a payment plan and were given the opportunity, they could keep their homes. But instead, the city is going to auction off a number of these properties and not lower the tax burden, but take people's homes and then say, oh, well, we have this huge problem with vacants, or we have this huge problem with people leaving the city of Baltimore. You're driving them from the city with the tax rates and with the collection notices on tax rates that are twice the rate of Baltimore County right across the line. It is twice as expensive to own a home on the tax basis in the city of Baltimore than it is right across the county line. And that's striking. That means people are losing their homes. 6,500 people in the city of Baltimore owe less than $1,000 in tax liens, and they're going to lose their homes over it.
Well, and we also know, too, that when we talk about the vacants, we just heard it, the 15,000 vacant property, that's the number we hear often discussed when we're talking about this problem. But only 8% of the total vacants are the ones actually owned by the city and would qualify for this program. So if it's such a small percentage, is this really the right approach to handle the vacant problem? And how do you get a handle on the other properties, the rest of the thousands of vacant properties that are out there that aren't owned by the city but still have problems when it comes to just the structure? They're vacant, they're not livable, but they're not necessarily owned by the city. What does the city do about that? Jeremy?
Well, I'll tell you, there are two actually pretty simple solutions. We don't always have to legislate or create a new law to deal with something. We have two agencies that are more than capable of dealing with the problem. The first of which is HCD, the Housing Enforcement Division, has the ability to cite owners that have not kept up with their properties. Everything from high grass and weeds to if they don't have a use and occupancy permit, meaning that they can't use the property, or they're having zoning violations, they're redoing the property and they're not asking for permission, obviously for safety reasons. The second part of that is the state's attorney's office has prosecutors both within housing and within its own office. So if you have, for instance, drug dealers in the neighborhood that are using vacants, which we all know happens all over the city as stash houses, you can use the nuisance abatement statute. It is the most underutilized or never used statute that we created exactly for this reason. So we don't need to legislate necessarily. We just have to have a better partnership between housing and the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office so that prosecutors can go into court, whether it's on the civil side or on the criminal side, and deal with some of these vacant homes. With regard to the second point that you bring, the Environmental Control Board already exists. That's where the housing citation goes. Having a diversionary court like they have, allowing owners to come in that have some of these properties. You know, so many people used to come into court before me that inherited properties that when we say vacant, by the way, it's important people to know, vacant doesn't necessarily mean that someone's not living there. Under the law, vacant can mean that the property is unsafe. So you may have gotten one of these properties from your grandmother, grandfather, you simply inherited it, and you've had no affiliation or experience with the property. Now all of a sudden the property may be worth $20,000. It costs $300,000 to fix up. And there are a lot of people in these untenable economic positions. And like Sean was saying, if we're going to look at the usage of ARPA funds for tax sale, we should be looking at using those funds to help people that are already in this position. We shouldn't be looking to put more people at an economic disadvantage, because you know what's going to happen? Housing is going to say, you know what? You're here. Now we have to deal with you getting a use and occupancy permit. And if you don't, then we're going to have to cite you. And Nick Mosby's plan offers no relief to these individuals who may not have experience buying homes, renovating homes, or any sort of relief whatsoever. If housing says, well, hold on a second, now you've had the property for a year, we gave you $50,000, and you haven't finished the property and they don't have a UNO, those are $1,000 citations. And we shouldn't be putting people at a prosecutorial disadvantage, throwing them into the court system, essentially feeding them to the wolves, if we're not going to breed these cases for success.
Well, that's exactly one of the concerns that we heard from some of the council members during that heated debate, was that this program could, in fact, put low-income people in a financially precarious situation where they go through this program, they find themselves a homeowner per se, but then they find themselves in a situation where they can't pay for it anymore. Do you think that would happen with this program as written?
I think it most certainly would. When you compare this version of the program towards what happened in the 90s, the idea in the 90s was that we're going to go neighborhood by neighborhood. We're going to take one neighborhood and we're going to build around it so that as we take these homes, we know that the neighborhood around it is going to succeed well, looking at other development in the area. This particular program, you can't take, for instance, this program allows for one street of all vacant homes, for someone to buy one house on that particular street. If that person puts $300,000 into that home, which they probably don't have to do, only being given $50,000, you're not going to be able to get homeowners insurance. You're going to have issues when you're renovating the home, because we know that we have rampant issues with criminal acts that occur during renovations, which I heard at ECB. I deal with as a defense attorney now, and I dealt with as a prosecutor before. And so if we're putting these people in these isolated situations, one house on a block or one house on a block, whether it's 500 homes or $1,500 homes, you're not going to even improve the area. So if the goal of the program is to improve Baltimore City, then let's pick one area and let's push people into that one area and let that area thrive and use that as an example, which is what the Dollar House program in the 90s was sought to do and kind of meant to do. This variation of it just seems like scattershot with no intent to serve one particular neighborhood.
David, do you think that would be an approach to do if we change, if the council president pivots the plan a little bit and like Jeremy said, kind of target this revitalization into one specific community using perhaps the American Rescue Plan dollars?
Yeah, that makes the most sense at this point because you want to build up neighborhoods, not individual houses, because that probably won't work. And, another idea, and just, thinking outside the box here is, maybe this is funds that should go to minority contractors, the people that are actually fixing up these houses, because they know how to do this, and they can fix up the houses and then sell them once they have done that. And I think that to have this scattershot around the city, just it really does nothing. And again, to your point about 1,200 buildings out of 15,000, what is the city really addressing here? And this is still a bigger problem that the city needs to address. And we're talking about a lot of money. And what if this program continues after money runs out? Then city taxpayers will be paying for this. And again, I'm really concerned that people are going to be so anxious to own a home. They're going to see $1, right? They're going to get the dollar, pay the dollar, then they're going to get $50,000. But 2 years from now, when the lease is up, they may have repairs that cost $100,000 and may be in a bigger financial hole than they were when they began. So I'm concerned that the lack of education about what it costs to renovate a home, and has the city even looked at average renovations? What it costs? Is it 50? Is it 100? Is it 150 to get these houses up to code?
Yeah, we saw that during that meeting when we had all of those people inside City Hall, we heard from some people who came because they thought they could, in fact, buy a home for $1. And they were excited about that prospect, becoming a homeowner in Baltimore City. That's what they were wanting to learn more. But we also know that the criteria for people to participate is pretty limited. It has to be Baltimore City residents 18 and older, prioritizes first-time home buyers, and especially people who have lived in areas that have been historically redlined or average home sales at or below a certain value. And do you think that also, not only are we limiting the number of vacant properties that could become eligible, but are we limiting the pool of people who could apply as well, limiting it so much that it really wouldn't do very much? David?
Yeah, so I think that it's very limited right now. And, obviously what they're trying to do is appeal to a certain part of the city and trying to get, first-time homeowners into these houses, but expand the program and people that understand that this is, a bigger issue rather than just, paying $1 for a house, that
right.
You're going to have to, put yourself out there financially a lot more than that. And listen, there needs to be a lot more education about finances in this city. Is that, then you'll have a mortgage, you'll have property taxes. So this is not easy just to sell a house for $1 and you can walk in and put your bed down and you're good to go.
Sean, I want to ask you, looking at all of the issues and problems in Baltimore City right now, this has been something that the council president has tried to get through the city council for months. We saw it, it failed on a vote months ago, 7-7. That hearing ended without a vote. We have no idea what's coming next. Do you think this is really what the council president should be focusing on?
It's not. There's a number of preconditions for success and economic health in Baltimore, and homeownership is part of the puzzle, but it's certainly not a top priority. Public safety is first, foremost, second, and last. If there's no safety in the streets of Baltimore, it doesn't matter because people are going to leave the city, and people who do own homes are going to feel unsafe and won't have anything tethering them to their community, and one of those things is their home. So that's why we see more vacants, and as Jeremy said, obviously we see things turns into stash houses or other places where crimes are committed or people do drugs or whatnot in these vacant properties. And without public safety, we see none of the benefits that would be accrued by this, even if it did work well. Because at the end of the day, all of these things will break down over time because people won't move into Baltimore. They won't invest in Baltimore. They won't grow jobs in Baltimore. They won't live in the community. And more importantly, for Nick Mosby's purposes, they won't pay taxes because they won't be here. And if we don't have public safety and we don't have trust in government, which is underlying really the problem here, is that people don't believe city leaders when they say they're going to do something and they're going to follow through with it. Then people aren't going to pay their taxes for that matter. They're not going to live up to their obligations as citizens because their leaders don't live up to theirs.
Was it a political liability for him to move this forward and put such a big emphasis on this plan if it doesn't look like it's going to get through? I mean, a lot of people are looking to him to make this happen, and if it doesn't, do you think that could hurt him?
It certainly could, but I think Nick Mosby, if anything, is a gambler. He has a lot of high-risk plays right now. He's obviously a party to some criminal cases, and his wife obviously is implicated in a federal one, and he has political ambitions, so it's go big or go home, and I think Nick Mosby's number one concern is Nick Mosby. Nick Mosby's political future, Nick Mosby's own ego, and going forward with this, obviously, I think comports with what we know about what he's done in the past, so I'm not surprised that Nick Mosby would push this, even if it isn't all the way thought through, because Nick Mosby is seeking political points. I wish that he would sit down with people who've thought about this more in terms of the practicalities of what this would look like, even on a practical level. I'm actually kind of surprised that the NACA, the group that conducted that protest, would engage in something so frivolous, because they actually do mortgage counseling. They do housing counseling all across the country, and some of their work they do is very good. So it's kind of surprising that they would back this, knowing that without any kind of support structure, many of the future or would-be homeowners would be left out to dry.
Jeremy, you've been in Baltimore for quite some time. Have you seen anything like what we saw inside City Hall that day? I think it was April 26th when we had the guy from NACA yelling at city council members. There were hundreds of people in there. The council president was yelling. It seemed and felt pretty chaotic inside the City Hall. What are your thoughts on that scene?
Well, this wasn't the first time it happened. We both know that when there was discussion at City Hall regarding the Johns Hopkins police force, when they sought to have their own independent police force, there was a sit-in, there were some pizzas ordered, but it was certainly not banging on the mayor's door. It wasn't as disrespectful towards a lot of the colleagues like Odette Ramos. You know, I think the most telling thing here, to go to Sean's last point, is the fact that affordable housing has never been and will never be a sexy issue. But it's an issue that requires discussion. And is it important? Yes, but it has to be done the right way. If they did it the way that Councilwoman Odette Ramos suggested, looking at the tax issues, like both David and Sean have mentioned, looking at the issues that come before the Environmental Control Board, the citations, their ability to enforce laws on the books, that's what keeps homeowners here and what keeps neighborhoods nice. But when you're talking about putting consumers in a bad position, it's not that Nick Mosby's wasting their time with the issue. It's that he chose a bad bill, and now we're having vote after vote, we're having meeting after meeting, and if legislation isn't thoughtfully and architecturally designed to gain favor with everyone around, then you just need to move on from it, like Sean said, and focus on the next cog in the wheel, which is public safety. So no, look, we've seen this battle in City Hall, we've seen it again, but this is what happens when we have, frankly, immature people that are not really thinking about the community, they're thinking about themselves. And if he was thinking about the community, they would have teamed up with Odette Ramos, who had housing legislation before the city, well before Nick Mosby ever did, and we would have moved on and we could focus on what actually matters, which is the 300+ murders a year.
We're talking a lot about the vacant homes and the crime problems, and we've done stories several times about how connected they are, and we're hearing from people at home all the time, too, about their concerns about public safety. I do want to go to a viewer question that we had submitted to us for tonight's town hall. The purpose of this is to hear from the viewers about the issues that we're talking about. I want to read this one question. It kind of talks about what we're issuing. Question number 3, it says, how can we be sure this won't make the housing shortage even worse? We obviously have had a lot of conversations about affordable housing. Baltimore City, if we want to attract more people, we saw the census numbers come out. People are leaving by the hundreds of thousands, leaving Baltimore City. If we want to address the housing shortage, how do we make sure that this doesn't actually exacerbate the problem? We'll go around the room, but we'll start with David.
Yeah, so we really don't know what the effects of this legislation will have on, a housing shortage here in Baltimore City. And really getting back to the political liability of Nick Mosby, is he made it a liability when he brought this gentleman in and caused this ruckus. And what I think is fascinating is you have Democrats that voted against this. this proposal. And afterwards, you have the ruckus that happened in City Hall, and I think you're going to have fewer Democrats now support this bill. But getting back to the idea of housing shortages, we just don't know when this starts. And again, this is a drop in the bucket to the 15,000 vacant buildings that are here, and so we just don't know the effects of it yet.
Sean?
I'm going to disagree with the premise of the question only because there isn't a housing shortage in Baltimore. Baltimore had nearly 1 million people in the 1950s. Baltimore has less than 600,000 today. The housing stock hasn't changed except for in quality and accessibility in terms of actually being livable. There are plenty of spaces where people could live, but because there are vacant homes or dilapidated homes or other challenges, that housing stock is unlivable, unusable, and owners don't occupy it. And that's the problem here in Baltimore. We have the capacity to fit nearly 1 million people into the city confines of Baltimore without building more high-density housing whatsoever. And the problem is that we haven't fixed the problem of giving people incentives to maintain and expand their homes and give people the opportunity to invest in their own communities because of short-sighted decisions at City Hall, to a certain extent in Annapolis, and this is just the latest.
Jeremy?
I would love to have a housing shortage in Baltimore City. Who wouldn't want to have a housing shortage in Baltimore City? If you look at the District of Columbia, not 50 miles away, you have neighborhood after neighborhood that when I was growing up was not a desirable neighborhood, rampant with crime. You had the crack epidemic of the 90s. And then lo and behold, now you have people rushing to buy homes. I would love to suffer from that problem in Baltimore City. This is not going to create a shortage. The real problem, what that it'll create is we are going to put mostly young people at an economic disadvantage, and then 5 to 10 years from now, we're going to have those homes back. We don't need to look that far back to 2008 to see what happens when we put young people or inexperienced people into homes that they can't afford with predatory lending. This, to me, is a variation of predatory lending. You can't sell somebody a house for $1. You could give them $10,000, $20,000, $50,000. If the home takes $300,000 to fix or $100,000 to fix, and I've talked to contractor after contractor, I've talked to investors about this. If you're not giving them the total amount of money to fix the home in a neighborhood where the home will accrue value, you're going to have a loan-to-value problem immediately upon encountering the home, which means they're not going to have equity in the home. It's impossible to build equity in the home. And the number one problem that no one wants to talk, if you can't get insurance on the property, then what's the point of being a homeowner? And so if we have to solve those problems on the front end. But I'd love a housing shortage. Let's create one in Baltimore City. I know it's a bad joke, but like Sean said, the population density has declined. It affects our taxpayers, which I know David knows. And if we don't have people paying taxes, we don't have better services. Let's get a housing shortage.
Well, that brings us to another question from a viewer who submitted this question talking about homeowners insurance. It says, who will be responsible for homeowners insurance through this program? Because we know that this is essentially a 2-year lease from the city. David, do you have any idea? Would the city be on the hook for the homeowners insurance until the homeowner takes, I guess, complete ownership over it? Or is this another part of the plan where the details aren't fully hatched?
So the details aren't fully hatched, and I would say that the city would never be responsible, never say never in this city about the money that they will spend. So 2 years from now, they may say, well, we need another $100 million for homeowners insurance for these folks. And let's not forget that we also have interest rates that are rising, and this could really put another financial burden on folks that are buying these homes because they are going to have to borrow more money to fix up these houses. $50,000 maybe gets you a nice kitchen. It's not going to get you a full renovated house. So, the costs will keep on piling up. And again, 2-3 years from now, the next mayor may say, well, let's spend $100 million to, keep boosting these people up. And at some point, taxpayers just have to stop saying, enough is enough when it comes to taxpayer money.
Yeah, you talk about the $50,000 grants. I mean, I think we've all seen a show or two on television about how much money it takes to renovate a property. $50,000, it is a lot of money, but when we're talking about a property and sometimes in the shape like we saw in that video right now, crumbling, $50,000 likely wouldn't be enough to completely renovate it. So then what would the homeowner have to do then? If they are buying this home for $1, they get a $50,000 grant, it upgrades one room, then what?
Well, and that's the big question for these folks, and and they're trying to entice people from lower income neighborhoods to do this. So this isn't middle class or upper middle class folks that will be getting this dollar or paying this dollar. So again, it's a huge financial burden. And what's going to happen? Are we going to see an increase in bankruptcies? Are we going to see people under the gun here when it comes to their finances? And the problem is that it sounds good, right? Is buy a house for $1. Everyone's doing backflips going, heck yeah, I want to buy a house for $1, but they don't think about the long term. And that's just another problem in our society is they don't think about the long term. But in this case, the city is sanctioning that and is sanctioning potentially really bad fiscal decisions from folks that should be making better financial decisions for themselves.
Well, the housing department isn't, right? And I think that should we should talk about that because the housing department is not on board with this. They're the ones that would have to be going through and talking about the applications, talking with folks who are going through and applying for this, and they're not fully committing to this plan either. Sean, you talked about incentivizing the maintenance of homes in the city. How do you think, what would that look like?
Well, you could give people a tax break for fixing up their home or give them some kind of incentive in terms of an abatement. We give developers in this city hundreds of millions of dollars every year to redevelop and reallocate things. So we actually already have programs. I believe there are over 50 what are called opportunity zones here in the city of Baltimore under census designated spots, and that allows investors to come in and spend money to beautify and to invest in businesses as well as become landlords, and that should be put down to the micro level. If the local guy on the block wants to buy a vacant house and put his own money into it and turn it into a rental, great. That's something we should encourage, entrepreneurship and people investing in their communities. So many of the people are so frustrated at the vacancies on their own block that they would love the opportunity to come in and fix it up and turn it around. But Nick Mosby is narrowly tailoring this into an owner-occupied situation, which both David and Jeremy pointed out, many of the people who would be eligible for this program shouldn't be eligible for this program. And we should put it another way. The old adage is a horse is a gift that eats. To give a man a horse is to impoverish him. You would say the same thing about a boat. In this case, Nick Mosby's gift is a house. It will actually bankrupt people in both homeowners insurance, taxes that they will futurely incur because they did it on the cheap. And this is actually not a dollar home program. It is a $49,999, that is $49,999 gift to people because you're getting $50,000 in cash in exchange for $1 on a purchase price. So we're giving that money away, and that we're narrowly tailoring it only to home ownership and only on the designated list that the city housing department or whomever draws up. Well, people, I would say I'm not the biggest fan of the universal basic income, but just giving people cash and giving them the opportunity to spend it the way they want to spend it would actually be a less paternalistic way for them to decide what's best for them. If they want to go to college, if they want to start their own business, maybe that's their way to upward mobility, not owning a home, especially a home that could be dilapidated or structurally unsound, like David's alluding to. These houses could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to make livable. And then they'll be right in front of the Environmental Review Board all over again because their house isn't up to fire code. I mean, there are so many problems that these people are walking into, and they're creating money pits for people who are completely oblivious to the fact that these are going to cost them more money than it's worth. And the city's just trying to use it as an excuse, a feel-good excuse to offload a bunch of vacant properties instead of knocking them down or dealing with the other underlying issues related to the taxes or title deed problems, which we could talk about later. But there's a huge amount of underlying structural problems that City Hall needs to clear up first and foremost before we start giving anything away.
Now, Jeremy, you talked about some of the when you're getting cited for some of these issues and you go before a review board. The state's attorney's office plays a role in that. Can you elaborate a little bit more?
That's actually a completely civil citation process.
Okay.
But the one thing it's important to note in discussing that process is let's just simplify what's happening here. Somebody is going to buy a home. They're going to go into that home and they're going to get $49,999. And then they're going to have to comply with all of the building regulations under the city code. They're going to have during a pandemic, they're going to have to find a contractor. We know there's supply chain issues. Well, you better have your materials ready. There is no stay on HCD, which is the enforcement arm of housing, enforcing these zoning requirements, these housing requirements for getting use and occupancy permits, so you can actually occupy the property. So if the city was coming forward, like Sean or David were saying, and saying, you know what, we're going to give you a stay. We're not going to enforce these codes against you. We're going to give you the time to get a use and occupancy permit, because we know that the pandemic has caused horrible supply chain issues, not to mention the cost of materials is 50 to 100% of more than what it was before. It's hard to even find wood or computer chips. So if you're talking about getting these building materials, you're already putting these people at a disadvantage during COVID. And then beyond that, HCD has to have enough building inspectors to go out. And there's already a delay because they're trying to catch up from COVID where they were before when they couldn't inspect these homes. So there's already such a disadvantage within the system itself that if you're putting 1,000 or 500 people into this new system, HCD is responsible for going to these properties and viewing it, the building inspectors themselves. That's such a stress on an already stressed system. We've had this conversation with regard to restaurant inspectors, where the city is missing over 50% of restaurant inspectors. That same issue they're suffering from at housing. Almost every inspector job in the city, they're understaffed. You know what? Let's go add more jobs and responsibilities. Let's add more constituents to care for. It's not that I don't want constituents taken care of, but let's not put constituents in a precarious situation. You know, we have so many people. Let me just say this. We have the only 2 law schools in the state of Maryland, the only dental program in the state of Maryland, the 2 medical schools in the state of Maryland. We have all these graduate programs here in Baltimore. Why not incentivize these graduates to stay in Baltimore City with tax incentives to buy homes and raise their families here and have their professional lives here? Because those are individuals that are going to be working within the hospital systems, that'll be working within the legal community. And it's not that I want to discriminate upwards towards people that are already in their careers, but those are individuals who will be able to afford some of these homes, who will be able to capitalize on some of those funds and to take advantage of the tax base to keep our professionals here. If we're going to put people in a lower economic situation in these situations, then we have to care for them in a way that we may not have to care for someone coming out of medical school that we know is going to be making $100,000, $200,000, $3,000. And that's just basic economics, or else we end up in 2008 with a bubble bursting, predatory lending, and people losing a home that they've loved to be in.
2 things with that. First, David, do you think that that would be an appropriate use of tax dollars if the city were to amend this current language, or perhaps just introduce a new bill or a new plan to incentivize homeownership the way Jeremy just explained?
Yeah, I do, because again, it's an incentive, right? And you know, my question is that you get the $50,000, and after 2 years, let's say you've done some renovations, maybe not all the renovations, but you've spent the $50,000. What happens? What happens if you just walk away from that house? You spend 50 grand, you have the 2-year lease, and you're like, wow, this ain't working for me, and you just leave. Well, guess what? You have a vacant building again. I mean, it's probably in a little bit better shape than when you went into it, but it doesn't fundamentally solve the problem. So that's why you want to build up these communities, these neighborhoods. And, you know, this city has so many problems when it comes to education, crime, safety, that, you know, we have to look at this holistically and not just have a, you know, what sounds like a popular bill. And you have the housing department that says, you know, they don't support this. I mean, if that shouldn't be the reddest of red flags, then I don't know what is. If their own housing department is saying don't do this, which, I mean, they're going to get the money and they're going to be able to distribute it. So something is amiss here.
Well, okay, so we don't know where the votes stand now after the 7-7 vote in the first committee. Then we had what happened in the city council chambers. We don't know where the votes stand now. It's unclear if the council president would have enough support to move forward. We have the rising cost of inflation. We have concerns about the pandemic and other economic instability happening right now. Sean, is now the time for this bill? Is now the time for this plan?
No, but relief for homeowners in the city of Baltimore is. We have all of this recovery money out there, $641 million, and some of it needs to go to taxpayer relief. There are other programs, particularly public safety and the schools, obviously contingent on massive reforms, that would benefit massively from an infusion of cash to get back to first world standards in a real sense. But at the end of the day, a very cheap investment, I would say less than 1% of what Nick Mosby's planning to spend, would be to hire, exactly as Jeremy was saying earlier, about 10 people at the recorder and register's office to handle deeds, because we know there are at least a few thousand and upwards of 10 to 20,000 people in the city of Baltimore who do not have clear title to their homes. And those are the homes who often end up on the vacant list, often end up on the tax sale list, because somebody dies without a will, and therefore when they promise their grandniece, or they promise their cousin, or they promise their son or daughter that they were going to inherit the home, that never got put down on legal paper. And when that doesn't happen, there is a question as to who owns the home and who pays the bills and who is responsible at the end of the day for those liens and judgments. And instead of clearing that up, these things called tangled titles, we're going to spend tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars for something that could cost a few $100,000 and do a lot more good and a lot quicker for a lot of people in the city of Baltimore. And let's talk about the elephant in the room here. What Council President Mosby is talking about when he says redlining and disadvantaged communities and longtime residents is he's opposed to gentrification, and he's talking about building African-American wealth. I want to do that more than anything because this city deserves to be the great city it is. But in order to do that, people need to have access to the capital and equity in their homes. And African-American homeowners who don't have clear title don't have access to that equity. They can't borrow against it. They can't sell it free and clear. And that means there are generations of people in Baltimore who have no right to the property that is theirs.
We've talked about the issue of the titles in the past. How many, if you had to guess, how many properties are in that situation right now?
We know that we've heard estimates of at least 3,000, and other people have suggested that based on sort of the opacity of it all, it could be up to 15,000, maybe even 20,000 homes have some confusion as to who owns the title. And these are the houses that are actually being occupied. I think Jeremy alluded to this earlier, that there are homes that are vacant, obviously that there's title issues, but there are occupied homes that are classed as vacant, and there are vacant homes that have clear title. So they're not one and the same, but there's a Venn diagram here. But we know that there are up to 10,000, maybe even 20,000 properties across the city, which is a huge amount of wealth that if those were redeveloped, or even if they're in good shape, could be borrowed against, that is not accessible by the people of Baltimore.
Now, Jeremy, you talked too about the people who do own some of these vacant properties, but they're not doing anything to maintain them. How do you address that problem?
You know, everybody's a snowflake, but they're all snow, right? We have to deal with the fact that they're all vacant, and we want to deal with them similarly, but you have some people that are just in economic situations. You know, I remember people coming in saying, oh, my friend bought this one house, and I thought it would be a good idea. I paid $20,000. I didn't realize it would take me $200,000 to get the house up to speed, or my wife had cancer, and we had to shift the money elsewhere. There are a portion of people that were singular home investors or dual home investors that got trapped. But there are also people that try to take advantage of the market, you know, that did the work, that didn't go through housing. Now they're getting hit with citations and there are vacant notices on the property, and they've just stopped doing work on it because maybe they can't get a renter or they don't want to comply with the city because it's too difficult. Ultimately, there's one solution. The only solution, and this goes back to something that City Councilwoman Odette Ramos said, which is housing's just going to have to cite these individuals into compliance. It doesn't mean fine them into perpetuity. It doesn't mean take the money out of their pockets. But if you bring them in by citation to a court like the Environmental Control Board, get them in the same room as a housing official or representative from housing, there were some fruitful conversations when I was there. So many, unlike a criminal courtroom, I remember day after day when I did those hearings of the housing official and the homeowner sitting there and having an educational conversation. You know, ma'am or sir, this was the problem. This is why I cited you. This is how to fix it. Giving their personal cell phones, telling them to call them, telling them how to fix the problem. That's a more holistic approach here. And I'm not saying everyone should be cited, but I think that that's the only way to bring compliance. No different than the same issue we're having in criminal prosecution now. We've ignored a drug problem for 2 years by not prosecuting anything in Baltimore City. And now we have people passed out on soups. We have a horrible drug problem, worse than it was before. We have to prosecute people into compliance, whether that's in civil or criminal court, even if that's just dragging people in to give them help without penalty.
What about the people who have been cited, they've gone to court, and they just simply won't make the necessary upgrades or renovations to the property? Is there any mechanism for the city to then handle that if the homeowner is still owning it, they're not doing anything?
That's how properties end up in tax sales. So depending on the nature of the citation, if the homeowner either chooses not to pay the citation or is given a fine in court and chooses not to, certain types of citations under the city code are then can be placed as liens on the property, and then the property can go to tax sale. Thousands of properties a year, like Sean said, hundreds, if not 1,000, would come through Environmental Control Board. And there was an effort by the court at that point to reach out to people and say, let's salvage your property. The city doesn't want to have to deal with these properties. And so I remember sitting there for 8 to 10 hours a day working on these tax sale cases, trying to figure them out with homeowners. So no, 100% there is a solution. But if you have somebody that is so neglectful that they don't want to deal with the property, either by choice or indecision, eventually that property is going to go to tax sale, and it'll end up like one of the many properties that Sean mentioned previously.
Is that process taking too long, do you think? Looking at the problem that we have, we know that only 8% of the vacants are city-owned. The rest of them are privately owned. I guess, what's taking so long to get people to comply?
Well, you have to have buyers for these homes. And part of the reason I brought up mentioning these other universities or building African-American wealth in this beautiful city is you have Coppin and Morgan and all these other programs, and we've had this national conversation about student debt.
Yeah.
Well, if President Biden is not going to alleviate that problem, or Congress is not going to step in to alleviate that problem, what better way to help our Baltimore City residents by saying, you know what, if you graduated from Morgan or Coppin or University of Maryland Medical School or Law School or University of Baltimore, my alma mater, the law school, then we'll give you a tax incentive if you build your family here, and we tie it to your debt to income ratio so that you get a little bit of that relief with student loan debt while also being a resident and taxpayer of this city. A lot of people may not like that plan, but to me, isn't it better to have somebody raising their family here that's invested in the city than to just throw $50,000 at somebody? Sure, if it works for 2 or 3 people, you can always have a success story, but it just doesn't feel like it's going to work for the most, and it definitely didn't work for a lot of the people that came before an ECB who purchased these properties, paid way more than $1, and didn't have $300,000 to fix a home, which a lot of people don't.
David, earlier you talked about the importance of having education surrounding this program, and that brings us to question number 1 from our viewers tonight, and I think this really drives it home. It says, will I really be able to buy a home for $1? The question is simple, but the answer is not, and I think that really highlights the necessity to talk about how expensive this program really could be for people who want to get involved.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a theme emerging here with the 3 of us, is that the homework hasn't been done by the city council, by Nick Mosby, to look at the ramifications of this, whether it's fiscal, whether it's otherwise. And whenever a city takes on a new initiative, my piece of advice is, has it been done elsewhere? Has another city done this? And what have been the results of where it's been done before? Is pick up the phone, go to the computer, Google to see what other cities have done. This seems to be a rush. And, it gets to the heart of this is a political, pursuit for Nick Mosby. And listen, I think that, he does want people in homes, but, $1 home, well, that sounds great, but the homework hasn't been done. And, Jeremy has said this, Sean has said this, is that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, whether it's deeds, whether it's insurance. And so there's a lot to be done.
There's a lot that goes into it, and it does feel like it comes back to the politics here, because obviously the city council, they're all Democrats. Everyone has their own plans, their own agendas, and what they want to get accomplished while they're in office. Do you think the city council president has a backup plan for this, if this is one of the big plans that he's hanging his hat on? Sean, we'll start with you.
I don't think he has a backup plan as to what's going to revive Baltimore, because he's put so much into this and to other sort of political optics that he's going to continue to double down on this or other kind of stunt proposals that haven't been thought through. And unfortunately, the people of Baltimore will suffer because Nick Mosby is either up or out. He's either running for higher office or he's out of office and maybe, locked up. But that being said, Nick Mosby isn't going to give up pretty easily. And I think he's going to stick with this.
The divide on the city council with this issue, though, I think is interesting, looking at just the politics of it, because you have Councilman Z. Cohen, Councilwoman Odette Ramos coming out, kind of sticking up and pushing back on what happened. Specifically on April 26th, there were several members calling for a formal apology from the council president. He said that he did issue an apology, but they said that it wasn't enough. Do you think that this could further divide what we're seeing, kind of fracture in various groups among the city council? Jeremy?
I am absolutely thrilled for the first time since this city council has taken office for them to be fractured. We've seen Eric Costello come out this week and call out Marilyn Mosby for why her office has 77 of 222 positions filled, of why they're so short-staffed. We've seen the same city council person call out the police department. We've seen Zeke Cohen and Odette Ramos call out Nick Mosby. It's about time that they fight. That's what I want out of my politicians. I want different ideas and different fighting. I've never seen a city council president like Nick Mosby or his wife Marilyn Mosby succeed more through failure. Whether it's the failed prosecutions unnecessary for Freddie Gray, whether it's housing bills like these that make no sense, it's the idea of I'm going to put this dream idea out there, and if everybody crushes it, it's your fault for crushing it, and you're hurting the constituents, when in reality, they're the ones saving the constituents from this horrible problem. But I think it's healthy. I think it's fresh air. I think it appears as though the city councilman, because his wife was indicted, has had a stranglehold on legislation within that council. And I'm, for one, am absolutely thrilled to see people like Eric Costello, Odette Ramos, and Zeke Cohen. And I welcome others like Christopher Burnett, whose name is in the letter, to come out strong and to say, this isn't how you run city government. You're not helping the constituents. And maybe we'll finally get some answers from both Nick and his wife.
You brought up the letter. You brought up some of the issues that we're talking about unrelated to the Dollar Home Program. Let's dive into that a little bit, because the three letters that the Councilman Costello sent, you mentioned, to the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. Monzi wants to know more about staffing. That's something that we've obviously been looking into for a long time, especially when it comes to the Safe Street stuff. They also want to know more details about the City Watch cameras, the State's Attorney's Office, the staffing issues, and then the crime plan. They want a short-term crime plan by June 3rd. Sean, do you think that those issues are something that all of the City Council, including the Council President, should be behind in demanding answers for?
Absolutely. Public safety is no longer segregated to East Baltimore, West Baltimore, and a few other neighborhoods. It is now a citywide tragedy. And finally, people are waking up to what so many people in the city have suffered for generations. And it's fortunate that there is a fracture now that people are talking about these things, because otherwise there was a cone of silence around them. And the fact that Councilman Costello and Councilman Stokes and others are saying, hey, no more, I'm fed up, is a good sign. It's a healthy sign that the city of Baltimore may be turning a corner. It may be far away, but they're going to come to it and say, we need to do something about these underlying issues. And so I'm very pleased to see that there are members of the council who are willing to stand up and be counted. We hope that good solutions come out of that, but at the very least, them talking about it and not just hiding behind each other is a positive development.
You know, in that letter, too, they talked about the homicide rate. You know, we're on track. Baltimore City's on pace to see more than 300 homicides for the 8th year in a row. They're saying this is unacceptable. And I wasn't at that news conference, but why now, I guess, is the question. When we've seen the homicides continue for the last 7 years, why is the 8th year the one that seems to be the pressure point for some of these council members?
I'll be blunt here. Somebody told me this about why Rudy Giuliani became the mayor of New York. And he said, it's not the blood in the streets, it's the trash in the streets is the why that Rudy Giuliani became mayor of New York and turned around that city. And violent crime obviously dropped precipitously. People are normalized to the horrible violence in Baltimore. Nothing about that is why they're outraged. They're outraged because their constituents in other parts of the city are now feeling the brunt of the violence. When Little Italy and Inner Harbor and other parts of the outer city are now part of the problem, people are waking up and saying, oh, this is not just somebody else's problem now. And now all the members of the council are feeling the pain. And that's what has taken them to this point, is that so many of these members of the council could say, that's not my problem, that's somebody else's on the council's neighborhood. But now everybody feels it. And so once it becomes localized, these councilmen and councilwomen have decided to step up.
David, talking about looking and demanding answers specifically for Monzi, the Mayor's Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, they want to know about staffing. They want to know about employees. How many employees do they have? Where does the funding come from? How long are they on the payroll for? Details about the City Watch cameras. Those all sound like things like taxpayers should have the right to know the answers to. Do you think that the City Council's in their lane for asking for that information?
So this is critical information, and we know the government does one thing well, and that's collect information. So the city knows exactly how many cameras there are. They may not know how many employees, because that can kind of get out of hand, but the government collects information. And again, people aren't seeing results, and people don't mind paying taxes if they see a city that is improving, that is prospering, if they see an education system that is working, $1.2 billion for education. People wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that if kids were actually being educated. The same thing with crime and safety. What's fascinating, taxpayer night a few weeks ago, a lot of people were saying defund the police. We're in a city that has a crime problem, and people said they're spending too much on police. So there's a lot of disconnect here.
Jeremy, another part of the letter, you talked about it, was directed specifically at the city state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, and her office. You talked about staffing. We've had this conversation with several people about the level of staffing happening right now in her office. Is that contributing, do you think, to some of the crime and some of the problems that we're seeing in Baltimore?
It's not even a question. It's a definite yes. I really urged people during the pandemic, especially if you were home, they could sign on to the Baltimore City Circuit Court virtual hearings. And what you saw day in and day out as prosecutor after prosecutor left that office in droves, like leaving Egypt, what you saw was the judge naming a case, State of Maryland versus Jeremy Eldridge, for instance. That never happens. But they read the case, and then no prosecutor knows who's handling it, and then they're calling a supervisor to find out who's handling it. And if they don't even know who's handling felony cases, and now we know there's a felony dismissal rate of approximately 50%, so 1 in every 2 felony arrests the police are making, the state's attorney's office is charging, indicting, and setting for trial, is being dismissed, and they're short 75% of their office and prosecutors, of course it's making a difference. And I think we're seeing that. Last month we had 3 murder losses in 1 week. So the state's attorneys tried to combat that by coming out and saying, oh, well, I got a life sentence here, I got a life sentence there. But we know the conviction rate in her office is really closer to 62% or 63%, not this 95%. If you count the dismissals, I guess what kills me is this. In sports, we hold sports players accountable. You throw 4 interceptions, you get benched, we bring the next quarterback in. The state's attorney's office job seems to be the only job in Baltimore City where we don't hold this Marilyn Mosby accountable for her poor performance. She throws 4 picks, and we let her sit on stage with Prince. You throw another 4 picks, you get reelected for another 4 years. She's done this because she's convinced the public that the police misconduct wave is everyone else's fault but her own. We're 7 years removed from it. I've represented Sean Suter, who was murdered. I've represented victims of police misconduct. I've represented police officers. But Marilyn Mosby foments this distrust in the community. And until we have a prosecutor that can rebuild that trust with the community and rebuild that trust with the police, where they're not constantly playing one off of another, we're never going to be able to reduce the crime rate. You go back 10 years, everyone still had guns. They were still stealing ATMs. Crime hasn't changed that much outside of robbing weed dealers on Instagram from when I was a prosecutor. But when I was a prosecutor, everyone sat down at a table. The mayor said that they were going to have the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, which I sat on a subcommittee for. We're 2 years into the mayor being in office. We're just putting out applications for this committee. That was the committee where all the partners of the criminal justice system came together and fetched to each other about the different problems and solved them.
Jeremy, I'm going to have to cut you off there because this hour has gone by. And I just want to thank all of our panelists for joining us tonight for our town hall. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you next time.